In the closed, echoing corridors of San Quentin State Prison, where concrete absorbs screams and time seems permanently stalled, one name has lingered for 4 decades: Jarvis J. Masters. To some, he is a condemned man sentenced to die for a prison homicide. To others, he is a Buddhist author, a poet of stillness, and a symbol of how the machinery of justice can grind forward even when its gears are misaligned. His story is not merely about a slaughtered correctional sergeant in 1985, but about how truth can be buried beneath fear, incentives, and institutional momentum. On May 5th, 1985, San Quentin Correctional Sergeant Hal Birchfield was brutally stabbed while working a tier dominated by prison gangs. The assault was swift and calculated. Birchfield was slain with a sharpened piece of metal, a handmade weapon known inside prison walls as a shank. The homicide sent shockwaves through California's prison system. In an era already defined by violence behind bars, the pressure to find those responsible was immediate and overwhelming. San Quentin needed answers. Prosecutors needed convictions, and the state needed someone to blame. Jarvis J. Masters was already serving a life sentence at the time. Raised in foster care, abused, illiterate until adulthood, Masters had entered prison hardened and volatile. But by the mid-1980s, something unexpected had taken root. Through Buddhism, Masters began a profound internal transformation. He practiced meditation, wrote poetry, and sought stillness in a place engineered for chaos. None of that mattered when his name surfaced during the investigation. Prosecutors alleged that Masters had conspired in the homicide by fashioning the sharpened metal used to slay Sergeant Birchfield. Not that he wielded it, not that he ordered the attack, but that he made the weapon. In 1990, after a trial built almost entirely on inmate testimony and handwritten prison notes known as kites, Masters was convicted of conspiracy and murder. The outcome stunned many even then. The inmates accused of ordering and carrying out the stabbing, the men directly tied to the physical act of homicide, received sentences of life without the possibility of parole. Jarvis J. Masters, accused only of making the weapon, was sentenced to death. It was a punishment imbalance so severe it raised immediate questions, though those questions would take decades to reach a broader public. The evidence was fragile from the start. Jailhouse informants testified that Masters had bragged or confessed. Kites were presented as proof of coordination. Yet these same forms of evidence have long been criticized as among the most unreliable in criminal justice, especially within prison culture, where survival often depends on bargaining with authorities. Over time, the foundation of the case began to erode. Key witnesses recanted, admitting they had lied or been pressured by investigators. Some described promises of leniency. Others described fear of retaliation if they refused to cooperate. Most damning of all, another inmate later confessed to having actually made the murder weapon himself. Despite these revelations, the machinery did not stop. Masters remained on death row. Even as his reputation outside prison walls evolved, he became a published author, writing books on Buddhism, mindfulness, and suffering. His words reached far beyond San Quentin, touching readers who found it impossible to reconcile his gentle, spiritual voice with the image of a man who supposedly engineered a prison homicide. The contradiction fueled advocacy. Slowly, artists, legal scholars, faith leaders, and innocence organizations took notice. By the 2000s and 2010s, Masters' case had become a symbol of something larger, a cautionary tale about capital punishment, informant testimony, and prosecutorial overreach. Public support grew louder. One of the most striking voices came from Jeremiah Birchfield, the victim's own son, who publicly called for Masters' release, stating that executing an innocent man would not honor his father's memory. When Oprah Winfrey added her voice, the case entered mainstream consciousness, no longer confined to legal briefs and prison walls. Still, the courts moved slowly. On September 3, 2024, a U.S. District Court denied Masters' federal habeas petition, a crushing setback after years of litigation. But the fight was not over. On January 22, 2026, Masters filed a major appeal with the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, marking one of the most critical moments in his decades-long battle for exoneration. The appeal challenged the integrity of the original trial, the credibility of recanted witnesses, and the constitutional fairness of a death sentence imposed under such circumstances. In October 2025, as California dismantled its historic death row, Masters was transferred to the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. The move was administrative, not liberating. His death sentence remains intact, a legal shadow that follows him from cell to cell. Yet the symbolism is impossible to ignore. A man sentenced to die now lives outside the walls of death row, while his case continues to unravel in the public eye. Jarvis J. Masters' story is not just about whether one man is innocent or guilty. It is about what happens when the state chooses certainty over truth, when fear outweighs fairness, and when a system designed to deliver justice instead perpetuates doubt. Somewhere between the slaying of a correctional sergeant and the quiet discipline of Buddhist meditation lies a question the courts have yet to answer fully. Did California condemn the wrong man to death? Until that question is resolved, the case of Jarvis J. Masters remains one of the most haunting and unresolved true crime stories in modern American history. August 21st, 1971, dawned like any other day inside San Quentin State Prison, but by nightfall it would be remembered as the bloodiest day in the institution's brutal history. What unfolded inside the prison's adjustment center was not just a failed escape, but a violent rupture that exposed the volatile intersection of radical politics, racial warfare, and the unforgiving machinery of the American prison system. At the center of it all stood George Jackson, revolutionary author, Black Panther affiliate, and co-founder of the Black Guerrilla Family, whose final hours would ignite a chain of slaughter that still reverberates more than half a century later. George Jackson was no ordinary inmate. Convicted at 18 for a minor robbery and given an indeterminate sentence of 1 year to life, Jackson became radicalized behind bars. In prison, he devoured political theory, embraced Marxism, and authored Soledad Brother, a collection of letters that transformed him into an international symbol of Black resistance. To supporters, Jackson was a political prisoner. To prison officials, he was a dangerous ideologue capable of mobilizing violence. By 1971, Jackson was housed in the Adjustment Center, San Quentin's most restrictive unit, alongside inmates deemed uncontrollable. Tension inside the unit was constant, electric, and primed for catastrophe. According to official accounts, the catalyst arrived in the form of a smuggled handgun. Prosecutors later alleged that Jackson obtained a small pistol hidden inside a tape recorder, or possibly concealed in a wig, delivered by his attorney, Stephen Bingham. Whether intentional or not, the weapon found its way into Jackson's hands. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Jackson allegedly produced the gun, ordered guards to the floor, and began opening cell doors. The Adjustment Center, designed to isolate violence, suddenly became its epicenter. Correctional officers were taken hostage as inmates poured into the corridors. Chaos spread as alarms blared and control evaporated. Jackson reportedly issued orders, directing inmates and moving with purpose. But the uprising unraveled almost as quickly as it began. As inmates attempted to move toward the yard in a desperate bid for escape, gunfire erupted. What followed was not a liberation, but a bloodbath. By the time the smoke cleared, 6 men lay dead, their lives extinguished in a matter of minutes. 3 were correctional officers, Sergeant Jer Graham, Frank DeLeon, and Paul Cresinas. All 3 were found with their throats slashed, a level of brutality that shocked even hardened prison officials. 2 inmates, John Lynn and Ronald L. Kane, were also slain amid the violence. And finally, George Jackson himself was gunned down while running across the prison yard, shot multiple times by guards. Official reports claimed he was attempting to flee. Supporters would later insist he was executed. The truth remains contested, buried beneath decades of conflicting testimony and institutional secrecy. The aftermath was immediate and severe. San Quentin was locked down. Investigators flooded the prison. The state demanded accountability. What followed was one of the most controversial prosecutions in California history. 6 inmates were charged for their alleged roles in the escape attempt and the resulting homicides. They would become known as the San Quentin Six: Hugo Pinnell, Willie Tate, Johnny Spain, David Johnson, Fleta Drumgo, and Luis Talamantes. All were accused of participating in the uprising and being complicit in the slaughter of the guards. The trial stretched on for years, marked by political tension, racial division, and allegations of prosecutorial overreach. Defense attorneys argued the case was built on fear rather than facts. That responsibility for the deaths had never been clearly established. The prosecution countered that the uprising itself made every participant culpable. In the end, the verdicts were mixed. Some defendants were acquitted outright, others saw charges reduced or dismissed. But the damage was done. The San Quentin Six became symbols, either of revolutionary resistance crushed by the state, or of unchecked prison violence masquerading as ideology. Among them, Hugo Pinnell would become the most enduring figure. Acquitted of murder but convicted of assault, Pinnell was sentenced to life and spent the next 4 decades in solitary confinement. His name would resurface decades later when he himself was slaughtered in 2015. A grim reminder that the blood spilled in 1971 had never truly dried. The ripples of that single day extended across generations of inmates, gangs, and prison policies. August 21st, 1971, changed San Quentin forever. Security protocols hardened, isolation units expanded. The state became increasingly willing to bury inmates alive in concrete cells rather than risk another uprising. Yet the questions raised by that day remain unresolved. Was George Jackson an architect of violence or a man driven to desperation by an unjust system? Were the guards victims of a revolutionary plot or casualties of institutional failure? And did the response to that day prevent future bloodshed or ensure it would continue in quieter, more controlled forms? What is undeniable is this. On that August morning, ideology met iron bars, and the result was homicide on a scale San Quentin had never seen before. 6 men were slain. Countless lives were altered, and the prison system doubled down on control rather than reflection. The bloodiest day in San Quentin's history was not just a riot, it was a warning, written in blood, about what happens when pressure, politics, and power collide inside walls designed to contain them. On the morning of October 5th, 2018, the condemned unit at San Quentin State Prison slipped into a rare and unsettling silence before erupting into violence. Death row is designed to be controlled, segmented, and predictable, a place where men already sentenced to die are kept apart to prevent exactly what would soon unfold. At approximately 9:55 a.m., that fragile order shattered. Jonathan Fajardo, a 30-year-old inmate awaiting execution, was attacked in the recreation yard and fatally stabbed in the chest and neck. Within minutes, alarms sounded and guards flooded the yard, but the damage had already been done. Roughly 40 minutes later, Fajardo was pronounced dead, becoming one of the very few inmates in California history to be slain by another death row prisoner. The rarity of the homicide sent shockwaves through the prison system. Murders between condemned inmates are almost unheard of due to strict supervision and movement protocols. The last comparable incident in California had occurred more than 2 decades earlier, in 1997. That fact alone transformed Fajardo's death from a routine prison stabbing into a disturbing anomaly, one that raised urgent questions about security, gang politics, and the hidden dynamics operating even in the most tightly controlled corners of San Quentin. Investigators quickly focused on Luis Rodriguez, a 34-year-old condemned prisoner with a violent history of his own. Rodriguez had been sentenced to death in 2015 for the AK-47 slayings of 2 rival gang members, a crime marked by its brazen brutality. Inside San Quentin, Rodriguez was identified as a member of a Latino prison gang that stood in direct opposition to Fajardo's affiliations. According to authorities, Rodriguez allegedly used an inmate-made weapon fashioned from smuggled or repurposed materials to carry out the attack. How such a weapon made its way into a death row recreation yard became one of the central mysteries of the case. Jonathan Fajardo was no stranger to violence or notoriety. He had been on death row since 2011, convicted for the 2006 racially motivated homicide of 14-year-old Cheryl Green in the Harbor Gateway area of Los Angeles. The slaying of Green, an African-American teenager, sparked intense racial tensions and widespread protests, drawing national attention to issues of hate crimes and gang violence. Fajardo was identified as a member of the 204th Street Gang, a predominantly Latino group, and prosecutors argued that the crime was driven by racial animus. His conviction and sentence placed him among California's most reviled offenders, a status that followed him behind prison walls. Despite that notoriety, death row is typically governed by an unspoken rule: survival through separation. Inmates are caged individually, movements are staggered, and contact is minimized. Recreation yards are closely monitored, with strict limitations on interaction. That Rodriguez was allegedly able to approach Fajardo, deploy a weapon, and inflict fatal wounds exposed a crack in a system designed to be airtight. Witnesses reported a sudden, violent confrontation. No prolonged fight, no warning signs, just a rapid burst of lethal intent. The stabbing wounds to Fajardo's chest and neck indicated a deliberate effort to ensure death, not merely injury. Correctional officers intervened swiftly, restraining Rodriguez and securing the yard. But the response came too late to save Fajardo's life. Medical staff attempted emergency treatment, but the injuries proved catastrophic. As word spread through San Quentin, officials initiated an immediate lockdown, sealing off death row and launching a full-scale investigation. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, alongside the Marin County District Attorney's Office, began probing not only the motive behind the homicide, but the logistical failure that allowed it to occur. Gang politics quickly emerged as a likely catalyst. Even on death row, affiliations do not dissolve, they harden. With nothing left to lose, condemned inmates may act as proxies for conflicts that began years earlier on the streets or in lower security yards. Prosecutors explored whether the slaying was spontaneous or sanctioned, an act of personal vengeance or a message delivered on behalf of a larger network. Rodriguez's alleged gang ties and Fajardo's background suggested a collision of long-standing rivalries, compressed into a brief, deadly encounter. Equally troubling was the question of the weapon itself. In a setting where metal is scarce and scrutiny is constant, inmate-made weapons should be nearly impossible to construct or conceal. Investigators examined whether the blade had been smuggled, stolen from maintenance supplies, or fashioned over time using overlooked materials. Each possibility pointed to systemic vulnerabilities, small failures that, when combined, enabled homicide even among prisoners already condemned to die. The slaying of Jonathan Fajardo forced California's prison system to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even the harshest sentences and strictest controls cannot fully extinguish violence. Death row is often portrayed as the final holding pen, a place where danger is contained by isolation. Yet on that October morning, violence slipped through the seams, proving that human conflict does not end with a death sentence. It only changes shape. In the aftermath, Fajardo's death joined a grim ledger of prison homicides that challenge assumptions about control and punishment. For victims' families, it reopened old wounds. For prison officials, it raised alarms about security lapses. And for the public, it offered a stark reminder that behind San Quentin's walls, even those awaiting execution remain actors in a volatile world governed by fear, loyalty, and unresolved rage. The homicide was rare, but its implications were anything but. By 2025, the iron myth surrounding the Aryan Brotherhood had finally been pierced in a federal courtroom, exposing how one of America's most violent white supremacist prison gangs continued to orchestrate slaughter far beyond prison walls. What prosecutors revealed was not a relic of 1970s prison politics, but a living, breathing criminal enterprise, one that used smuggled technology, encrypted communication, and rigid hierarchy to order homicide from concrete cells deep inside California's most secure institutions. The trials marked one of the most significant blows ever dealt to the Aryan Brotherhood, a gang born at San Quentin nearly 60 years earlier and still capable of commanding bloodshed across Los Angeles County. The Aryan Brotherhood, known simply as the AB, was founded in the 1960s at San Quentin State Prison, emerging from racial tensions that followed desegregation. What began as a supposed protection group for white inmates quickly evolved into a highly disciplined white supremacist organization built on fear, loyalty, and extreme violence. Membership was limited, betrayal was punishable by death, and authority flowed from a small inner circle known as the Commission. By the 1980s and 1990s, the AB had become synonymous with prison homicide, drug trafficking, and contract slayings, extending its reach from cell blocks into neighborhoods across California. Federal prosecutors argued that by the 2000s and 10s, the gang had modernized its methods without abandoning its brutality. At the center of the 2025 trials were three high-ranking leaders: Kenneth Johnson, Francis Clement, and John Stinson. From inside state prisons, including San Quentin and Pelican Bay, these men allegedly directed at least 7 homicides, 2 carried out behind bars and 5 executed on the streets of Los Angeles County. The victims were not random. They were rivals, debtors, informants, or members deemed unruly, individuals who violated gang rules or threatened the organization's control. Each name added to what investigators described as an evolving hit list, enforced through terror. The engine driving this violence was technology. Smuggled cell phones, small, easily concealed, and devastatingly effective, allowed AB leaders to bypass prison surveillance entirely. Using encrypted messaging apps and coded language, they communicated with foot soldiers on the outside, issuing orders, approving slayings, and managing drug distribution networks. Federal agents presented evidence showing how messages traveled seamlessly from maximum security cells to Los Angeles streets, transforming prison sentences into command posts. The walls that were supposed to contain these men instead amplified their authority. Kenneth Johnson and Francis Clement were portrayed as central architects of this operation. Prosecutors detailed how they authorized homicides as a form of discipline and profit protection. If a dealer failed to pay, if a member questioned orders, if a rival gained influence, a decision was made. The result was slaughter, carried out with chilling efficiency. Some victims were ambushed in their homes. Others were gunned down in public. In 2 cases, murders occurred inside prison facilities themselves, reinforcing the message that no location, inside or outside, was beyond the gang's reach. John Stinson played a different but equally critical role. While not always directly linked to the physical execution of homicides, Stinson was accused of authorizing violence and overseeing the gang's drug trafficking operations. Prosecutors argued that he functioned as a gatekeeper, ensuring that violence served the enterprise's financial and strategic interests. His authority helped sustain a system where narcotics sales funded weapons, bribes, and continued control. Violence was not impulsive, it was managerial. The trials painted a picture of a gang that operated more like a corporation than a street crew. Decisions were debated, approved, and documented through messages. Murder was a tool, not an outburst. Jurors heard testimony from cooperating witnesses who described the terror of refusing an order. To disobey was to invite death, not only for oneself, but for family members on the outside. Fear ensured silence. Silence ensured survival for everyone except the targets. In May 2025, the federal verdicts came down. Francis Clement and Kenneth Johnson were convicted of RICO conspiracy and multiple counts of murder in aid of racketeering. Both received life sentences, effectively ensuring they would die in prison. The court emphasized that these were not men reacting to their environment, but leaders who exploited it, using incarceration as cover while directing homicide across county lines. The sentences were meant not only to punish, but to dismantle a command structure that had thrived for decades. John Stinson was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for his role in authorizing murders and managing the gang's drug enterprise. While lighter than life without parole, prosecutors described the sentence as significant, reflecting both his authority and the evidence presented. His conviction underscored a critical point. Even indirect involvement in homicide, when tied to organized crime, carries severe consequences. The reckoning did not stop there. In November 2025, Danny Troxell, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood's elite 3-man commission, was sentenced to life in prison. Troxell represented the highest tier of the gang's leadership, men whose approval was required for major decisions, including executions. His sentence effectively decapitated what remained of the AB's top command, signaling that federal authorities were no longer content to target only foot soldiers. Throughout the proceedings, San Quentin loomed large, not just as the birthplace of the Aryan Brotherhood, but as a symbol of how prison gangs evolve rather than disappear. Many of the defendants had cycled through its tiers, absorbing its culture and exporting its violence. Pelican Bay, with its extreme isolation units, also featured prominently, illustrating the paradox at the heart of American incarceration. Even the most restrictive environments can become nerve centers for organized crime. The 2025 trials marked a turning point, but not an end. Prosecutors acknowledged that dismantling leadership does not instantly erase an ideology built on fear and racial hatred. Yet the convictions demonstrated something unprecedented, that the state could follow the digital trail from prison cells to homicide scenes and hold the architects accountable for the blood spilled at their command. In the end, the story of the Aryan Brotherhood's hit list is not just about gangs or prisons. It is about power, how it adapts, how it survives, and how it corrupts systems meant to contain it. For decades, the AB ruled through silence and slaughter. In 2025, that silence was finally broken, replaced by courtroom testimony, digital evidence, and life sentences that stripped the gang's leaders of the authority they once wielded from behind bars.